Nathan Smith on the line here from Italy, which is really exciting. You're my first international interview, and I'm calling this a second opinion because we met in Italy on the McKay Photography Academy trip, and you shot solely with the Fuji X-T1, and I have to say I was a little jealous on more than a couple occasions when I was looking at what I was lugging around, and you had that little backpack full of lenses, full of the Fuji X-T1, and it looked mighty nice. Now, I just want to give folks a quick recap of my review of the Fuji X-T1. It was back in the spring now, I think. I really loved the output. I loved the viewfinder. For me, it felt a little bit too manual, though, almost. Christina disagrees, though. For those who have watched the podcast, she's a big fan of the way the form and function of that camera. But I felt like I had to take my eye away from the viewfinder or the LCD screen to make some of the adjustments. But other than that, I really did love it. Now, clearly, you're a fan, since that was the only camera you walked around Italy with, Nathan. And I thought it would be fun to bring you in here for a second opinion on this camera and share a little bit about how you arrived at it and what you like about it, what you've learned shooting with it now, and things of that sort.
Okay,
yeah?
Sounds great.
Okay, so let's do a quick background for folks to know that you didn't just pick the Fuji up off the street and start shooting with it. You've got a little experience as a professional photographer. Yeah, and you want to give us a little background of how long you've been shooting and what you've traditionally been shooting with, and some weddings as well, or primarily weddings.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead. I'll start a little slideshow here while I share a little bit about what I do, if that's all right.
That's great. That would be perfect.
Okay. Yeah. Start. Okay. Anyway, I've been doing weddings professionally for 32 years, actually. Did my first one in 1982. Started shooting Olympus cameras. I had Olympus OM1, then I shot for years with Olympus OM2s. I had two of those, and then they finally bit the dust. I started shooting with a Nikon F4. I added Hasselblads to my arsenal, and at one point I had a kind of a dream Hasselblad setup with two bodies, 4 lenses, prism finders, the works. And I would shoot with the Hasselblads for all the formals, and then I would shoot with the Nikon film for everything else. And then from there, I went to digital first with a D70, 6 megapixels, and that replaced the film camera, but I still kept using the Hasselblads. Then I went to a D200 at 12 megapixels, and I finally decided, why am I carrying around a suitcase of Hasselblad stuff? And so I went strictly digital, shot with D200s and D2Xs for a number of years. And then I went to a D300S and a full-frame D700. This right here is from a wedding I did that appeared in October 2000. This year's Vogue magazine, the October issue. This particular photo was there. It was quite the wedding.
Yeah.
And this particular wedding actually ran from 5 p.m. to 6 a.m. So, and I was trying to shoot mostly available light. I wish I'd had the Fuji for that wedding. This is a wedding I did in Salt Lake just in June. And then here in a minute, all the shots you've seen so far are shot with the Nikon. But starting with this next photo, this was shot with the Fuji, and everything, the rest of these photos were shot with the Fuji.
Yeah. Well, I didn't put this on the list, but let's go back a little bit. How did you find the transition from film to digital? Was that difficult, and in any way paralleling some of the transitions you've gone from full frame to Fuji, not full frame?
Yeah, it was. It was quite an adjustment, mostly on the post processing. It was quite a difference. I mean, naturally, of course, I saved money on film and processing, but the post processing film actually was a lot easier. At the end of a wedding, I had maybe 13, 14 rolls of film. I would lay them on a light table and number them. and then send them off. I actually still use Pictage, and I've been using them for about 11 years. But they would scan everything, put it online, and then the bride would pick out her favorites, and then I would design the album digitally. So that was kind of easy. When I went to digital, of course, then I had to do more post-production work. But
Right.
but I enjoy digital. So
Yep. You probably end up with a few more photos too when you shoot digital.
yeah, I mean, before with film, if I shot 300 photos at a wedding, that was like a lot of photos. 300-400 photos was a lot of photos. Now, usually it's close to or over 1,000 photos at a wedding. And if my wife, sometimes she will shoot with me. It can be close to 2,000 photos at a wedding.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And so you started to make a transition, or at least started to use the Fuji some in your professional work. How did you arrive at deciding that was okay? Or let's take a step back. And there's a lot of mirrorless cameras choices out there today. How did you arrive at the Fuji X-T1?
Well, I wanted something lightweight. Now, it's interesting because I moved to Italy in 2002, and for the 2 years before that, I would work during the week in a camera store, and then I did weddings on weekends. And so I actually sold a lot of these cameras. I sold Canon stuff. I sold Nikon stuff. And honestly, Fuji, initially, I thought, yeah, these are really cool cameras, but it seemed like right after they released a camera, there were like 3 firmware updates. And so I was a little hesitant about going with Fuji. And honestly, mirrorless cameras at first, I felt like I was looking at a bad security camera video when you're looking through the viewfinder. And so, I was like, no, I want to stay with an optical viewfinder. But then the Fuji, the X-T1, I read these, a lot of pros I saw were kind of making that switch. I do 6-hour instructional tours in Florence where we walk around, and I'd be carrying the camera and 3 or 4 lenses, and most weddings I carry 2 bodies with battery grips and several lenses, and so my back would definitely appreciate the Fuji. And I saw what some of the photographers were doing with the Fuji, and I thought, well, this looks like a way to go because the resolution is there, the high ISO, I find it equal to my D700. If not maybe a hair better. Really? I don't have a problem shooting at 6400 ISO. So it was mainly a size and weight thing.
Right.
And I know that when Hasselblad first went digital, Fuji made their lenses for them.
Oh.
So I figured, I knew they were they made high quality lenses.
Right.
So,
yeah. Good.
So
and so you mentioned high ISO performance. There is a difference in sensor size from shooting full frame to Fuji.
Right.
Now for folks watching this in mirrorless, sometimes you can have a micro four thirds sensor, sometimes an APS-C size sensor. The Fuji does have that APS-C, which is a little bit bigger. You want to talk about some of the differences folks will run into when shooting with?
Sure. Well, for example, a very popular lens with full frame cameras is the 85 millimeter, like a 1.4 or 1.2 lens. And I see photographers going, the equivalent lens in the Fuji, of course, is the 56 millimeter 1.2 lens, which is a marvelous lens, and the reviews I've read on it have been great. I got a really good deal on the camera from Fuji, and I had to pick out I was able to pick out 2 lenses plus if I wanted the kit lens or not. And so I really wanted 3 lenses, the 10-24, the 23, and the 56. I opted to go with the 10-24 and the 23 because I have an 85 on my Nikon, and when I shoot a wedding, I always bring 2 cameras. So, but I wanted a fast, wide lens for the Fuji, so I will be getting the 56. And I did have a chance on the Italy trip to shoot with the 56 because Zachary, who was also one of the instructors, had it as well.
That's right.
But the 85, for example, on a full-frame camera, many photographers will spend an extra $1,000 to get the 85 1.4 versus like the 85 1.8. Both Canon and Nikon make an 85 1.8 that's $500, and the 85 1.4 with Nikon's about $1,000 more, and the 1.2 with Canon, I believe, is about $1,200 more. It's,
yep. Sounds about right.
It's up there.
Yep.
Well, if I shoot with my Fuji with a 56 next to a Canon shooter with the 85-1.2, and we're 10 feet away from a model, we're going to get basically, like if we're shooting head and shoulder shots, we're going to basically get the same framing, the same image,
right,
because we have the same angle of view.
Yep.
But
also sometimes people call it the crop factor.
Right, exactly, yep. Exactly. I'm not shooting, if I'm shooting with a Fuji, I'm shooting with a 56 millimeter lens. And of course, we know that a wider angle lens has more depth of field. Mm-hmm. And then, for example, if someone is shooting with a micro four thirds, they'd be shooting with like a 43 millimeter lens, which of course is even wider. And from all the research and studies that I've done myself, looking at charts, basically APS-C, you lose one full f-stop of shallow depth of field compared to the full frame equivalent. Yep. So the 56-1.2 Fuji will give you the depth of field of a 56 millimeter lens, which is equal to the 85-1.2 at f1.8. Right. So, and then of course micro four thirds, you'd be shooting, you would lose 2 f-stops of shallow depth of field. Now on the flip side, you gain 2 f-stops of depth of field. So that can be an advantage. For example, if you're shooting a wedding, I have the 23-1.4. And this wedding I did that appeared in Vogue, there were times where I was at 3200 ISO or even 6400 ISO. I'm at 1.4, and I still wish, and my shutter speed's down around a 30th of a second. I don't really want to go lower than that. But with the Fuji, I would get f2 depth of field instead of f1.4 depth of field, which actually could be an advantage. Right. So
you don't have to worry about it.
I think photographers just need to understand that. Yep. If you're going to sell all your Canon gear, understand the pluses and the minuses of what you're getting.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the pluses. So you're definitely giving up some depth of field, just mentioned, but what are some of the pluses?
The camera. Well, the big one, of course, is lightweight. And because of that, you can often be a little more spontaneous. You can sometimes get moments that you wouldn't get lugging a bigger camera. Sometimes I notice, like with my full frame Nikon, if I take the 70-200 and point it at someone, they feel like they've got a bazooka aimed at them, and of course they suddenly now get all self-conscious and they're not as comfortable. Yep. I've heard rave reviews about the new Fuji just released their 5140 2.8, which is kind of the equivalent of a 70-200. It's still about 2/3 the size of the Nikon, from what I understand, or the Canon, but it's still not as big.
Sure.
There's some other things. I actually, because I'm here in Italy, I do a lot of travel photography, and for the last 2 or 3 years with Nikon, I've actually been doing a lot of HDR photography. And with the Nikon, for example, for me to set it up, I have to push 2 buttons. I have to switch it to bracketing, and then I normally turn on CH or high-speed shooting, so the camera will automatically take 3 photos and then stop.
Okay.
So I can shoot handheld. So it's not a big deal, but I have to basically do 2 controls to set it into HDR, then I have to do 2 controls without. I love the fact that the Fuji has the little the bracket thing. I can just turn it over there, push the button, it takes 3 photos, stops, and I just put it back to S, and I'm back to shooting. So that's been a plus. The panorama mode is nice. Not something I use. Actually, with the Nikon, I often will take 3 photos and then later in Photoshop put them together in a panorama. But it's kind of nice just to have that on the camera.
Sure.
The controls, I love the way the controls are set out. I mean, they're I think this is what the Nikon DF wanted to be.
Yeah.
I don't know. Myself, I was really hyped. Nikon did a really good job pre-advertising that camera. And then I think when it came out, people were like a little disappointed that it wasn't as exciting as they wanted.
I don't think it has sold very well at all.
Yeah. Well, it was pricey, and it was... I am excited that... Because one thing, the Nikon DF, I was disappointed that it had a top shutter speed of a 4,000th of a second. Now, the Fuji right now, today, the black model, has the same thing, top speed of a 4,000th of a second. But on December 18th, they're releasing a firmware update which will allow you to get 1/32,000th of a second shutter speed.
Which is incredibly fast. Now, tell folks why would you want that fastest shutter speed? You trying to stop bullets?
Right. No, the big thing is that there's been times when I go out you're shooting outside, you're shooting on the beach, you're shooting in a really bright environment. You want that really shallow depth of field. You open your lens up to 1.4. I personally shoot RAW, so I drop the ISO down to 200, which is the lowest RAW ISO that you can shoot on the Fuji, and it's too bright. I mean, I have to stop down to 1.8 or 2 or even 2.8 sometimes if things are really bright. So those new shutter speeds will allow you to keep your camera wide open. The other thing that's coming with the firmware update is you can set it where the shutter is completely silent. So if you're shooting in a church at a wedding, you may remember that I got chewed out by that gentleman in the church.
I do remember that.
I was taking pictures during Mass, although I don't think it was the camera noise. I maybe was still going to got in trouble. Yeah. But anyway, it allows you to shoot completely silent. So at certain events, that can be very valuable. Right. But as the camera is, the shutter is has a much quieter shutter than traditional DSLR.
Yep.
So that's another advantage. The optics are amazing. Anyway, yeah. So
it's nice. You like it. Now, any counterpoints to my complaint of the kind of more hands-on and manual control? Are you able? Do you make adjustments to your shooting when it's right up to your eye? I mean, this may have been my inexperience or lack of time with it.
It's fine. I rewatched your review this morning, and it is true. There's a few. It's in some ways it's a little harder now. I personally, I'm not sure what Christina does, but when I shoot weddings, 95% of the time I shoot in aperture priority mode. Mm-hmm. So so normally the shutter dial is going to be locked on A. And actually, I almost the whole time in Italy, I actually was using the auto ISO, which I never used on the Nikon. I tried it on the Nikon, and it just seemed to pop all over the place, and I didn't like the way it worked. Maybe I was doing something wrong, but on the Fuji, even then, either I would leave it on A or I would lock it on a certain ISO for the lighting conditions that I'm in, and then at that point I would be changing the aperture, which of course is easily done here. So to me, I didn't have a problem with the automated mode. I mean, shooting automatically the way I do. Yep. Yeah,
nice.
Because usually I'm holding the camera like this anyway, so my hands are on the aperture ring here. In fact, I almost prefer this to the thumb wheel, the old, my Olympus originally had an aperture ring
front
on it.
And back thumb wheels and things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, good. All right.
One thing though that I'm still getting used to is with the DSLR, the viewfinder, of course, because it's an optical viewfinder, is always live.
Yeah.
And there was so many times I put the camera to my eye, I'm like, oh crap, I got to turn it on, or I got to hit the shutter button again to kind of wake up the camera. And so, of course, there's things you can do. I could set the camera not to go to sleep as long a period of time. And if I was shooting a wedding, I know that would never be an issue.
Right.
But it's just taking a little getting used to having having to turn on the viewfinder.
Right. Yeah. And battery life, you're finding?
Battery life's definitely less than the DSLR. When I was in Italy, I'd get about 350 pictures. Usually by the end of the day, I was down. Now, I do have the grip. I have large hands, and that was one thing that I really like about the Fuji is it does have the avail grip. I also really like having a vertical trigger for shooting like portraits. It's a little more comfortable than doing this business.
Yep.
And so, the battery life, often by the end of the day, the battery down here would be dead. But I still have one in the body, so it wasn't a big deal. I have 6 batteries, so
so you're ready.
Yeah, exactly.
So do you see yourself at a point in the future, basically bringing just the Fuji or bringing the Nikon too, but having it as only backup for shooting weddings?
Very possibly. I'm kind of debating that now because there is, like I say, like with an 85 1.4 on the Nikon, there's a little bit of advantage, but the 5612, from my experience shooting it and also the reviews, it's got great edge-to-edge sharpness wide open, which my Nikon 8514, I have the D version, which is excellent, but it's a little bit soft on the corners. Although normally when I'm shooting portraits, I don't care about really sharp corners.
Yeah.
So it's not an issue. But no, I could definitely see it. I even wish now, my church asked me to go shoot some headshots, and I thought, great, I got to bring my Nikon and that heavy lens. So no, I could definitely see shooting with just the Fuji. Yeah. So
you've been mentioning the 5612 a lot, which you've had a chance to use. But what's your favorite lens that you've been using currently, if you have one?
Actually, the 1024 is well for travel. Like when we were in Italy, I had that on my camera probably half the time.
Yeah.
I have 3 lenses. I have the 2314, I have the 1024, and I ordered from Fuji the 1855. They sent me the 18135 instead, which I was actually a little disappointed at first because I was like, well, I really didn't want a lens that was slower than f4. And the 18135, of course, is a bigger, longer lens than the 1855, but it's weatherproof, and I thought, well, this will gives me the equivalent of going to like little beyond 200, the equivalent of 200 millimeter. But no, the 1024 is a fixed aperture. It's f4, but it's a fixed aperture f4. It's internal focusing, really sharp. It's got 4 f-stops of shallow depth of field. I mean, it has 4 f-stops of image stabilization. Sorry.
Yeah.
And so I actually didn't shoot a lot with the 23 because when you're shooting scenics, even though the 1.4 obviously is 3 f-stops faster, it does not have image stabilization. So I could get sharp pictures. I got some pictures at 1/6 of a second.
That's great.
With the 1024 that were sharp.
Yeah.
That I wouldn't get. And the other thing I love about this is the fact that I wanted the widest possible lens for the Fuji, because for my Nikon I have 16 millimeters is the widest lens I have, and I wanted to buy the 1424, but this is basically a 1536 equivalent, so it gets me that super wide angle without the weight. But what I like about it, unlike the 1424 Nikon, if you suddenly want to shoot something, quote, more normal, you can only go to 24, which is still very wide.
Right.
Whereas the 1024, it has 36 millimeters as equivalent as a focal length.
Yep.
You know, the 24, and so I didn't really need the 23 much. Now at a wedding, of course, the one thing that optical image stabilization is not going to do is it won't stop subject motion.
Right.
So if you were shooting a wedding and people are mingling around, 1/6 of a second you're going to have a lot of.
It's going to be artsy. It's an artsy picture.
Exactly. Very much so.
Yeah. Well, good. Yeah, I've been finding similar things with some of these the image stabilization in many of the modern lenses is just fantastic and really lets you do some nice handheld shooting, and in a small lens like that as well. That's great.
Right.
This has been a great conversation. I think we're going to wrap it up with, I think, the most difficult question. And it's one that I've been getting fairly frequently now. Somebody comes and says, I'm pretty serious about photography and thinking of upgrading from my point and shoot. Should I go mirrorless or DSLR? And what would you offer them in advice?
Wow. Good question. Yeah. I think it partially depends on budget. I mean, your Fuji, to get a current model Fuji, even the X100 series, you're out at least $1,000 pretty much. You know, the X100T that came out is $1,299. You can now get the S model for just like $900, but you're close to $1,000. Yeah. You can get actually a decent little SLR. What's crazy is the cheapest Canons and Nikons at around $500 would outperform my $5,000 D2X from like
progress marches on. Yes.
Oh yeah. You know, it's amazing. Yeah. It's amazing. So you could do that. I think for most people, honestly, a DSLR would probably be fine. And honestly, the sub $1,000 DSLRs weight-wise are probably not that much different than the Fuji.
Right.
I mean, the big difference for me, I wanted a metal body camera. I wanted a battery grip. I wanted the vertical trigger. And so the Fuji was a nice way to go from a full-size heavy DSLR. But I think for a lot of people, kind of depends on budget. No, but the X-T1 is a marvelous camera. You could now get, I believe they're still on sale right now. You can, for about $1,500, you can get the X-T1 with the 1855 lens. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely a great way to go. The Viewfinder, one thing that I didn't mention, I mean, this has a bigger, brighter Viewfinder today. that I think it's bigger and brighter than anything that, even on a full frame $6,000 DSLR, the X-T1 Viewfinder is bigger and it's brighter.
Yeah.
So that's been really nice to.
I've been folks who have been watching my channel. I rave about that Viewfinder, and it's kind of the gold standard. I hold all other cameras up to when I'm talking about, because it is just amazing. Good. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. Where can folks find more of your work? And I do have some fans in Italy, and some fans who travel to Italy. They might want to take a photo tour with you. Where can they find out more information about that?
If they go to nathansmithphotography.com.
Okay, I'll put a link to that right down below this video.
Okay, or if you go on Facebook, facebook.com/Nathan Smith Photography will also get you to my Facebook page. So either way.
Okay, great. All right, well, thanks so much, Nathan. This has been a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to you getting that firmware update so you can be a little sneakier in the churches and cathedrals in Italy.
There you go. There you go. Thanks.
Thanks. All right. Bye-bye.
I know.